Thank you for joining us, Mr. Deputy Minister. President Putin said earlier this week, before the sanctions bill was passed, we are exercising restraint and patience, but at some moment we'll have to retaliate for this boorishness toward our country. You were the one who notified the Americans that the Russians would be expelling American diplomats and technicians, closing down some facilities. So is this what President Putin was talking about in terms of retaliation?
Yes, it is. And I think this retaliation is long overdue. You remember that the previous administration of the United States, the Obama administration, expelled Russian diplomats on December 29th last year and deprived us of our property. During the Trump administration, nothing happened towards, changing the situation, which is completely unacceptable for us. And I should say that after the Senate, the day before yesterday, voted, or rather on the 27th of July, voted so overwhelmingly on a completely weird and unacceptable piece of legislation, it was the last drop that made all this happen. We leveled the ground. We didn't go beyond what was expected by the US side. We sent warnings after warnings, and now we have a level ground, nothing to, complain about, in my view, on the part of the US. And my hope is that this vicious cycle of retaliation will not continue. Measures and countermeasures should stop by now. This is, in fact, something I told very forcefully to Ambassador Taft when we saw each other at the Russian Foreign Ministry the other day.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that meeting? Did you expect this would happen, and you already knew what the retaliation would be? I mean, it seems like a tit for tat. What do you expect to accomplish from this?
We are hopeful that after an effort on our part to persuade the US colleagues on the need to move from a very bad and miserable stance in which our relationship find themselves for the moment, that we now start as something different, try to start on a something different path. And that was the message all along. For 7 months, we waited so long, we thought it was sufficient time for decision makers in New York to change their minds. It didn't happen. Now we should start anew. And my call to the counterparts in Washington and also to Ambassador Taft is stop now. We should start building new house, a new construction of a very different type. Otherwise, everything will be in tatters, to use the word which President Obama used once on the Russian economy. As you can probably see from what is going on in Russia, our economy is not in tatters, and this very failed attempt of some members of the Congress to change this to the worse will fail again. I'm very sure about it. Russia does not do anything under the pressure.
Well, you talked about Congress. It is unclear whether President Trump will sign the bill, and a White House official said the president may decide to veto the sanctions and look for tougher measures than Congress. How would Moscow respond to that?
We will evaluate the situation the moment we know what the course would be. This is exactly the reason why we stopped on our action exactly at the moment, at the point where we could say now we are equals in terms of how our diplomatic missions in Moscow and other Russian cities and in Washington and other US cities operate. There is no difference between the two. So if the US side decides to move further towards further deterioration, we will answer, we will respond in kind. We will mirror this, we will retaliate. But my call and my whole point is, don't do this. It's to the detriment of the interests of the US. And I'm hopeful even those who are the worst adversaries of Russia in your country will understand this very simple logic.
Well, what are you talking about in terms of retaliation? Are you talking about possible sanctions, economic sanctions, punishing U.S. businesses, banning consumer goods?
We have a very rich toolbox at our disposal. It would be ridiculous on my part to start speculating on what may or may not happen, because that's against all the logic of this tit-for-tat play or a broader diplomatic game, whatever you would call. We are not gamblers. We're people who consider things very seriously and very responsibly. So it would be a complete professional failure on my part to disclose any of the options at this moment. But I can assure you that different options are on the table, and consideration is being given to all sorts of things, both symmetrical or asymmetrical, to use a very popular word in the world of diplomacy.
Well, you talked about the Russian economy not being in tatters, but you are emerging from a recession. Can Russia really afford to do this with the U.S. as its third largest trading partner?
I think we can, and I think also every single step which people on the Hill in particular take to make our lives more difficult brings us closer to the moment when we will develop all sorts of alternatives to the US financial system, to the dollar reserve currency system, dollar-based reserve currency system, to all sorts of areas where the whole world, and not just Russia, is dependent on very frivolous action on the part of the US. And I should say you undermine confidence in your system altogether. When we're talking on property, I believe every single child in the US understands what the words "no trespassing private property" means. Meanwhile, we saw the US law enforcers just taking completely unacceptable measures on private property that belongs to a foreign state. We can't have more evidence of a very wrong direction in which political thinking in the US has taken in recent time.
And what would it take to reset the relationship? You talk about Congress, but what about the relationship with President Trump himself?
I think the political will is what is needed most in this situation. And I believe there are several areas where US and Russia can and should work together cooperatively. Non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, countering terrorism, illicit migration, trafficking in people, climate change, you name it. And regional conflicts. In fact, we are working in a more positive manner on Syria in recent time. I hope this positive experience can proliferate to other areas as I have described. We are ready. We are stretching our hand forward. We are hopeful that someone on the other side, President Trump included, but also others, may see here a chance for a somewhat different way.
You know, you mentioned Syria. CIA Director Mike Pompeo said that any suggestion that Russia is an ally in the fight against ISIS has not been borne out in their actions. You seem to disagree with that. Can you give us some examples?
I think what is going on in Syria in terms of establishment of a zone of de-escalation in the southwestern part of that country is a very vivid, very impressive example of what is still possible. I think also we are partners at platforms like Astana process, like Geneva process. We are working on humanitarian issues. Despite all the differences, we made huge progress on dismantlement of the Syrian military chemical program. One may have further examples. Syria is a tragic place. It's an incredible bloodshed that happened there. We are still hopeful that despite all of this, it can be turned into a country where stability is established, where we have a sovereign, independent state that is, duly integrated in an international system. The Syrians should decide themselves what they should do with their country. Others, including us and the US for that case, should help them. And that's the whole core, the essential element of the Russian policy towards Syria. We invite US to follow suit.
I want to go back to President Trump again in the relationship. What do you think of President Trump? I mean, he has said the investigation into Russia and the Trump campaign is a witch hunt. So what do you think of him and statements like that?
Well, we respect President Trump as a leader of a nation that is quite superpowerish in so many ways. And thus, the reason for all the importance and all the attention we attach to this relationship. But we also think that the most unexpected and most strange and dangerous development that happened in recent time had to do exactly with a very speculative use of Russia as an ocean and relationship with Russia as a tool in a very bitter fight, in fact, in a bitter war against President Trump by those who still cannot live with an idea that they and their candidate failed at the previous election. Another thing which is very...
Well, you said, let me stop you there.
Please.
You said last November, just after the election, that there were contacts with the Trump team and that you knew most of the people from his entourage. What kind of contacts and who were you talking about?
You have to go through all the hearings and all the material which is available by now for the Congress and for the general public, and also through all sorts of leakages from the administration to CNN and other media outlets, to New York Times, you name it. You'll have all the names, but my point here is if the ambassador...
But I'd like to hear it from you, sir.
Sorry? Once again, an echo there.
Could you tell me the names and the contacts? And
that's what I'm going to do, ma'am.
I know. I'd just like to hear it from you, sir, if I could.
Right. If Ambassador Kislyak was not contacting some people on the other side, so to say, he wouldn't perform his functions as he should. And in fact, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations require diplomatic missions in every country to maintain as widespread contacts as possible, to learn more on the circumstances of the host country, to use the exact words of the convention. That was exactly what Kislyak was doing, and he was not spying and he was not recruiting. If he did so, I would be now a prima ballerina of the Bolshoi Ballet, if you know what it means.
It recently came out that Donald Trump's son and top members of the campaign met with a lawyer with ties to Russia. In an email written by an intermediary, Don Jr. was promised material gathered by the Crown Prosecutor of Russia, official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia. Was Russia providing damaging information on Hillary Clinton to the Trump campaign?
I think what is fair to say here is every single contact, every single call, every single message, every single email is being followed, scrutinized, eavesdropped by services in the US. We know how it is. We do think that it's to the detriment of the whole course of a better relationship. And in fact, you are in Washington. What is Washington? Washington is a city, Washington, D.C., where everyone meets and everyone talks. And the very fact that someone saw some Russian or Russians somewhere is now close to a criminal act. I think it's ridiculous. It's degrading for such a great country as the United States.
Well, was Russia providing damaging information about Hillary Clinton to the Trump campaign?
All the information which we provide to anyone can be easily found in open sources. We are not doing anything to the detriment of the domestic developments or internal affairs of any country, the US included. It's very, very far from the very principles of the Russian foreign policy, which is to be watchy on the preservation of international law, to be equal and respectful to others. That's what we are doing on a daily basis, and we will be guided by these principles also in future.
And President Trump says the U.S. Attorney General should look into Hillary Clinton's ties with Russia. Does the Russian government have any evidence she or any members of her campaign did anything criminally with your country?
The only ties to Russia of Ms. Clinton, which I'm aware of, are those working relationship which she established with Minister Lavrov when she was Secretary of State, and this is almost it. I don't know, I'm not aware of any other contacts or any other information provided to her by any Russian officials or any Russian citizens.
And finally, Mr. Deputy Minister, North Korea has conducted another ballistic missile test, another ICBM test. Secretary of State Tillerson said after the very first ICBM test back on July 4th, any country that provides any economic or military benefits or fails to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions is aiding and abetting a dangerous regime. South Korea said this week that Russia, have roughly doubled oil shipments and exports in the past few months compared to last year. That sounds like Secretary Tillerson's definition of aiding and abetting.
I think that it's very selective how people pay attention or quote sources. In some cases, you completely ignore what Pyongyang says. In some other cases, you highlight it to the exceeds. What I'm saying to you is we are prepared to work cooperatively with the US, with this administration, with Secretary Tillerson and everyone in his team on peaceful, pacific resolution of this issue. And that is to denuclearize the whole Korean peninsula. My hope would be that everyone there shows restraint. The provocations of the North Korean side are inadmissible, and thus Russia works with others, the US included, China included, on a series of UN Security Council resolutions that essentially impose measures on North Korea because North Korea is in non-compliance with international law and other decisions. But having said that, I would also say that like on this tit-for-tat game or play between Moscow and Washington, on northern Eastern Asia, we should be very worried not to inflict further damage. We should show restraint, and if US and US allies with whom we maintain excellent relationships show some restraint, I think it should be and will be heard and seen and detected and registered in Pyongyang, and thus we would open a somewhat different chapter there.
But when you talk about restraint, they continue to fire these missiles. So what's your reaction to this latest missile firing?
We are in the process of discussing a draft resolution of the UN Security Council that would take further measures, and we are prepared to do so. But this resolution should not equal measures that are targeted on stopping the illegal activities of Pyongyang in the area of nuclear weaponization and missile developments, to the whole issue of economic suffocation of the whole country. Here we have a red line which we should observe. We are hopeful we will find a way forward collectively, cooperatively in New York at the Security Council, and we will continue our bilateral exchanges with Washington on this issue because it's very serious and it's dangerous, and we are concerned. North Korea is very close to Russian borders.
And do you have any idea how soon you believe that North Korea would be capable of carrying a nuclear missile to the U.S. homeland?
I think we are years and years away from a moment when they can weaponize. What they're testing are quite primitive devices which require months for preparation and which are essentially pieces of equipment with all sorts of wires and all sorts of additional elements around them that simply cannot be put on top of any missile. So to come that small in terms of a weapon would require a very different type of technological quality and development. We differ with the US in the assessment of threat from North Korea. We think that the previous missile test was that of an intermediate range missile and not an intercontinental ballistic missile, as the US side and the US government says. But all this should be discussed, and that this is debatable, and we should find a proper way forward on a truly common basis. That's my whole point.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Deputy Minister.
Thank you for having me, ma'am, and I wish you good time in Washington.